Right. Okay, so today we are going to do Leviticus 14. And last week I mentioned that Leviticus 13 and 14 are really one unit dealing with cleansing. And so another longish chapter to read. Let me begin reading. Leviticus 14, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then, if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds and cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop." So here we are reading a passage dealing with how to cleanse a leprous person. Chapter 13, we had the diagnosis, the symptoms for a leprous person. We mentioned that the word uh, here in Hebrew refers to a whole lot of skin diseases and not just leprosy. But for convenience of reference, I think the ESV mentions leprous person, and the NIV talks about the infectious skin disease. And actually, not every one of these diseases mentioned in chapter 13 are even infectious. So again, that may be an incorrect translation. So here we have this person who's had a skin disease, he's cleansed, uh, and so he shall be brought to the priest. But then verse 3 tells us that the priest is going out of the camp. So I suppose you've got to read the two together. The priest is going out of the camp, and the leprous person is brought to the priest outside the camp. Okay, so if you're confused by that, just remember that you can still be brought to the priest outside the confines of the camp. Right. And verse 5, and the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. The Hebrew here is actually living water over living water. And the idea is either it is running water so that it is not stagnant, and stagnant water causes infection and spread of disease. So this is running water or water that is taken from a running source, a fresh source. Verse 6. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and let the living bird go into the open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but shall live outside his tent for 7 days. Now, verse 4 talks about scarlet yarn. Verse 6 also, the Hebrew actually just talks about the scarlet of the worm. So the yarn is supplied by the translator because the dye itself just can't be the priest just using the dye here. The dye from the insect, the worm, is used to dye something, to color something, and it's probably a piece of cloth because the priest is going to dip this cloth and the hyssop into the blood and to sprinkle it. And verse 7, sprinkling 7 times, is not 7 is the perfect number, and so it's basically symbolic cleaning, total cleaning, right? And the one of the birds is to be released to fly away, and this reminds us of the Day of Atonement, where 2 goats are brought to the priest. One is sacrificed, and the other is released to go into the wilderness. So this is the first stage of cleaning. And the verse 9, the second stage, on the 7th day he shall shave off all his hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. He shall shave off all his hair, and then he shall wash his clothing and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. You will see that this is the second shaving, yeah, because earlier on he is already shaved and on the first day. So 7 days later, he's shaving again. And verse 10 is the third stage of cleaning. And on the 8th day, he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb, a year old without blemish, and the grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil. Okay, the log here is not an English word, it's a Hebrew word. We are not sure how much this is. Maybe it's just 1 pint. And the ephah is another measurement of Hebrew, which we are not quite sure. But the ephah, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil. Verse 11, and the priest who cleanses him shall set the man who is to be cleansed and these things before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So the first cleansing is outside the camp. The second cleansing is outside his own tent. The Israelites are still nomads. They are moving around in tents. They're going through the desert, the 40 years of wandering. And so they all live in tents. So this leprous man will go back to his tent, but he's not allowed to go in. He's to stay outside the tent for 7 days. And finally, on the 8th day, he goes to the entrance of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and there is the final cleansing. Verse 12, and the priest shall take one of the male lambs and offer it for a guilt offering along with the log of oil, and wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. And he shall kill the lamb in the place where they kill the sin offering and the burnt offering, in the place of the sanctuary. But the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot. So here, the person is symbolically cleansed completely from head to toe, so to speak. The offering here, these are the offerings that we already studied in the beginning of Leviticus. There is the guilt offering, or sometimes called the reparation, the compensation offering, for giving compensation to the person who has been offended. And in this case, God is the one who has been offended, because for the number of years or months that this person has been outside the camp, he's been without communion with the community of God. And he could have been committing sins, or at least he has failed to give his tithes and offerings to God. So this is like a, now he's making up for it, compensation. And the sin offering, or the purification offering, is to purify himself of the sins that he's committed or omitted to do. And then the burnt offering and grain offering. And we remember that the guilt offering and the sin offering, from these offerings, the priest could partake of the sacrifice. He could eat it for himself and his family. So this is the compensation that the leprous person gives to the priest for the service of cleansing. Verse 15, then the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand, and dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand, and sprinkle some oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And some of the oil that remains in his hand the priest shall put on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed. Then the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. And this process is reminiscent of the ordination, the consecration of Aaron and his sons for service before God. So this cleansing of the leprous person is a very serious ceremony, and a very elaborate ceremony. Verse 19, the priest shall offer the sin offering to make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanness, and afterwards he shall kill the burnt offering. And the priest shall offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. And now the rest of the passage is about the poor leprous person. And actually, of course, depending on how many years he's been outside in the wilderness, outside the camp, he's got no economic sustenance. He's definitely poor. Practically every of them will be poor because they haven't had any job for a long time. So there's provision here for the poor leprous person. But if he is poor and cannot afford so much, then he shall take one male lamb for a guilt offering to be waved, to make atonement for him, and a tenth of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, and a log of oil, and also 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, whichever he can afford. One shall be a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. So there is still one male lamb to be offered, but the flour is reduced, and then the other lambs are replaced with turtle doves or pigeons. Verse 23, and on the 8th day he shall bring them for his cleansing to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. And the priest shall take the lamb of the guilt offering and the log of oil, and the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. Okay, the wave offering is of course part of the guilt offering, so it's one offering. Verse 25, and he shall kill the lamb of the guilt offering. And the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the priest shall pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, and shall sprinkle with his right finger some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before the Lord. So you find that in Leviticus and much of Hebrew literature, there is this fondness of repeating, and it's just exactly the same thing that's happened before, with slight variations with a few words here and there. And this is typical of Hebrew literature. The repetition is, of course, for several reasons. One is this was originally oral culture, so the repetition helps people to remember. And secondly, Hebrew poetry is fond of repeating, the same words with synonyms or expressed in different ways, so that it is also a feature of beautiful, at least in the eyes of the Hebrew person, beautiful language. Verse 28, and the priest shall put some of the oil that is in his right hand on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, in the place where the blood of the guilt offering was put. So blood was done, and now it's oil on the same right lobe of the ear, right thumb, and right big toe. Verse 29, and the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed, to make atonement for him before the Lord. And he shall offer of the turtle doves or pigeons, whichever he can afford, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, along with a grain offering. And the priest shall make atonement before the Lord for him who is being cleansed. This is the law for him in whom is a case of leprous disease, who cannot afford the offerings for his cleansing. Now, Leviticus chapter 14, verse 23 then begins a new section, because it has the words again, the formula that indicates it's a new section. The Lord spoke to Moses. Okay, and this time the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put a case of leprous disease in the house in the land of your possession, then he who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, there seems to me to be some case of disease in my house. So the first thing that the owner of a house must do when he finds something wrong in his house, some walls look like they're diseased, he goes and reports it to the priest. And we have said that the Hebrew word here, it's the same for the person as for the garments, as for the leather articles, and now for the house. And of course, the Israelites at this moment, when Moses is being instructed, they're still living in tents, and it will be a long way more before they get houses. But God is looking ahead, and He says, when you come into the land of Canaan, which He has promised them, which I give you for a possession, and I put a case of leprous disease. So some people looking at this phrase here thinks that God may be punishing the owner of the house for whatever sin he has committed, and the the house has a disease, has a fungus, a mildew, or whatever it is, an infection. And because the words are I put means God put it there, they think that it's because God is punishing the owner. But again, how the Hebrew looks at the world is important. He writes, and Hebrew literature would, no, Hebrew authors would write uh, this way because they ascribe everything to God. Everything that happens, even bad things, are ascribed to God. It is God who allowed it, even if He didn't do it. So God's will includes the will of what He declares and what He permits. So even if disease is a natural thing, God permits it to happen because there are perhaps lessons to learn, or simply because it is a fallen world and God has already pronounced that general curse, right? The earth is cursed because of the sin of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. So it's not necessarily because the owner of the house is a sin, because later on we read the owner of the house doesn't even have to be cleansed. It's only the house that is to be cleansed. So nothing to do with moral fault of the owner. Verse 36, then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priest goes to examine the disease, lest all that is in the house be declared unclean. And afterwards the priest shall go in to see the house. Now, this is a very curious statement. The house is diseased, is going to be cleansed, but the priest tells them, hey, please clear your house, empty the house before I come to examine it, so that not everything will be declared unclean. Very interesting, isn't it? So in other words, this cleanliness issue is not about disease and infection. It's really about ritual cleanliness. And until the priest comes to declare the house unclean, everything inside there is still clean. So take it out and you can continue using it. It's very practical uh, statement, a very practical instruction. Take out everything. We're just going to cleanse the house. And house, if it's unclean, it's going to be closed and it's going to be shut up. And the house will be quarantined. So you guys will have to be staying outside until the house is clean. Okay. Verse 37, and he shall examine the disease, and if the disease is in the walls of the house with greenish or reddish spots, and if it appears to be deeper than the surface, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house and shut up the house for 7 days. And the priest shall come again on the 7th day and look. If the disease has spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take out the stones in which is the disease and throw them into an unclean place outside the city. So the stones, the materials in the house cannot be recycled. 41, and he shall have the inside of the house scraped all round, and the plaster that they scrape off, they shall pour out in an unclean place outside the city. So it's like the man who is leprous. He is cleansed, his clothes are burned, and he's got the shave. So now the house is shaved also, is scraped off all the plaster and throw it outside the city. Verse 42, then they shall take the other stones and put them, they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and he shall take other plaster and plaster the house. So the house will be rebuilt, and if it's been It has a contagious disease. Now the contagion is stopped. Verse 43. If the disease breaks out again in the house after he has taken up the stones and scraped the house and plastered it, then the priest shall go and look. And if the disease has spread in the house, it is a persistent leprous disease in the house, it is unclean. And he shall break down the house, its stones and timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house while it is shut up shall be unclean until the evening, and whoever sleeps in the house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. But if the priest comes and looks, and if the disease has not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, for the disease is healed. And for the cleansing of the house, he shall take 2 small birds with cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop, and shall kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water, and shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet yarn along with the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the bird that was killed and in the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. Thus he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the fresh water, and with the live bird, and with the cedar wood, and hyssop, and scarlet yarn. And he shall let the live bird go out of the city into the open country, so he shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be cleaned. And so you see, the house is an object. It doesn't have morals. It's not expected to have morals. So the cleaning of the house is just 1 stage, not 3 stages as for the leprous person. Verses 54 to 57 is a summary of chapters 13 and 14, because it talks about an itch, garment, house, spot, which is all referred to in chapter 13, and 14 only refers to a house and the cleansing of the leprous disease. This is the law for any case of leprous disease, for an itch, for leprous disease in a garment or in a house, and for a swelling or an eruption or a spot to show when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law for leprous disease. So we're told in an earlier chapter of Leviticus that the priest is to know what is clean and unclean. His job, his professional duty is to make sure that Israel remains clean, and he's the one who is able to identify clean and unclean. And that's because God has very carefully and elaborately spelled out all the things that are clean and unclean. So, as I mentioned, there are 2 sections in this chapter 14, and marked by the words that the Lord spoke to. Okay, verses 1 and 33. And the first section is on the cleansing of a person afflicted by a skin blemish, or the leprous person, as ESV puts it. And the second in relation to cleansing of houses affected by the blemishes. And for both the house and person, Hebrew word ta'ara is the same. Okay, it is a disease, and it is a disease that makes the skin of the person or the house look terrible. So the person with the skin disease has been isolated outside the camp for a long time. He has been excommunicated from his community and excluded from God's sanctuary for a long time, and it is really very punishing for him to be isolated in a society which is very communal. For modern society, especially those who live in North America, Canada, and USA, and even in Europe, isolation is a good thing. You want to be alone. It's a very individualistic society. But for a person who comes from a communal society, a tribe, a clan in Asia, in Africa, it is extreme punishment, actually. So the Lord who inflicted the disease now heals it. I've mentioned that in Leviticus 13 and 14, there's no mention of how the disease is to be healed. Doesn't mean that the Israelites had no idea of how to heal, because they would have herbs and ointments and all that for healing, but it's just not the focus here. The focus here is not on the medical aspect of the disease, but on the ritual and the ceremonial aspect of the disease. And so now that this person is clean, God has healed him, God has pardoned him, it is time for joyous celebration. And so the ceremony of restoring him to the community is elaborate and extensive. And it's like a rededication. This person is excluded. Now he's to be re-included. And he is given this grand ceremony with 3 lambs involved. And probably 3 lambs enough to also have a big festival, right? Or the celebration that will come from eating that offering. And it takes place in 3 stages. First, verses 1 to 8 outside the camp on the first day. Second stage, inside the camp but outside his tent, verses 7 to 9, until the 7th day. And at the tent of meeting, the 8th day, verses 11 to 32. So you've got the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and then the whole outer walls of the tabernacle. And then you've got the camp, and then outside the camp out here. These, and the further away you are from the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the further away you are from God. Now, stage 1 cleansing requires 2 live clean birds. Of course, the birds will have to be alive before they're killed. But I think this is to emphasize that you don't bring dead birds, you bring the birds, and they have to be alive even as the priest receives the animals, the birds. There's no specific mention of what birds this would be, but in Leviticus 11, we've already been given a list of the birds that are unclean. And so we know what are unclean. Any bird that is not mentioned in that list will be clean. So the list there, as I mentioned before, primarily includes scavengers and predators, birds that eat other birds or other live things like lizards and reptiles and so on. So the birds that are not included in that list would be clean birds, and that would be birds like the sparrow, the turtle dove, the pigeon, and so on, right? Small birds. So some translations will say live small birds. And that would, of course, be because it's easy to get these birds. They're plentiful. The sparrow, for example, will be flying around plentifully, very easy to catch 2 sparrows. And because you're poor, you can't buy it. You got to go and catch it yourself, right? Anyway, 2 live clean birds, verse 4. And then verse 4 also says cedar wood, scarlet yarn or fabric, and hyssop. So the dye, the red dye, is used to color some fabric. And we're not sure whether it's linen or wool, which would be the common fabrics of this time. And we're not told, so we don't need to speculate. We're not told what these represent or why they are being used. What's the reason for this and that? Obviously, it's not so important. These are the things to be obeyed, and the Israelites to say, yeah, we just obey, God says so, and we will do so. We don't need to know why. But nonetheless, we modern people like to speculate and see meaning out of meaningless things. We feel important, we feel clever, and the many reasons. You could say some people will notice that cedar is red, and the scarlet yarn is red, and the blood is red, and so maybe red has a feature. It's a feature here, and probably represents blood, which is used for cleansing, and represents life, which is now what is being conferred on the leprous person. He was dead. He was the living dead outside the camp. Now he's going to be restored to the living. So red is life. Red is celebration. Chinese New Year. We Chinese understand. Red is celebration. We want red in everything. So is there any meaning? Maybe it's just colorful. Maybe it's just No, even though we do not know, we just know that this is the scarlet from the worm, the insect. Uh, well, the Hebrew uh, reader of this passage will obviously know straight away what is referred to, right? And we don't. But it doesn't matter. There's a dye, it's red, and it's being used. And the word can be it's a kind of red, yeah, scarlet, a very bright red, scarlet or crimson. Some translations use the word crimson, very bright. So this redness perhaps just represents blood, which is required for cleansing. And the cleansing is elaborate. It's not just blood, it involves blood, yeah, verses 5, 6, 12 to 14, etc. It involves water, verses 5 to 6, 8 to 9. It involves shaving. Now, when we are dirty and we shave, that is critical. And we watch movies, right? And if some man, I've seen a couple of movies where this happens, the man is living in the woods and he's all bearded up, and then he starts shaving, that this is the next stage of the movie. He's going to do something very important. That's why he starts shaving, and then he's clean cut, and then he goes and does his whatever vengeance or whatever that he needs to do. And the next part of the movie unfolds. So yeah, and I see this as an unfolding of the next stage of this man's life. Is now he was unkempt and untidy. He was told to be unkempt and untidy. Now he's got a new status. He's all shaved up. He looks handsome, right? And good and clean. So this is all part of the what's the word they do? Um, Not remodeling. What's the word?
Makeover.
Makeover, that's right. Yeah. The makeover, right. And part of the cleansing also is to let one of the birds fly away, verse 7. And this symbolically, as the bird flies away, the bird carries away the sins of the leprous person. So, yeah, maybe even just the graphicness of this whole thing, the red blood, the cleaning, the washing, the shaving, and the bird flying away, it just gives this person, as the bird flies off, his heart is lifted. And it's quite symbolic. Now, this cleansing involves 4 offerings, very serious. It's not one offering, but 4. The grain offering, verse 10, the guilt offering, verse 12, which includes the wave offering. The priest gets his portion of the food. The guilt offering is compensation, and the sin offering or the purification offering, verse 19. And for the house, of course, there's no sin, but this is just pure purification. And then the final offering, the burnt offering, a, a, a symbol of dedicating everything to God. It all belongs to Him anyway, and so it's burned up for Him and to Him. And all this is to make atonement and reparation and compensation for every possible omission and trespass, intentional and otherwise, while this person was outside the camp. He may have been a sinner and God has forgiven his sin and now he's back. Or even if he didn't know disease, as I mentioned last week, Jesus himself says disease is not always a sign of punishment. And so it could be just simply um, a result of the fallen world. There's disease everywhere, there are bacteria and viruses everywhere, and you just got caught, not because of a specific moral fault, but because germs are everywhere, bacteria is everywhere, viruses are everywhere. And it's important to remember what Jesus said in John, right? Chapter 9, verses 1 to 3. Not every disease is punishment from God. When Jesus was asked, this blind man, is he blind because of his sin or his parents' sin? Jesus is neither, but only that God will be glorified. So God was glorified in the healing of the blind man that day. That was for God's glory and not because of the sin of the person who's blind. And I find that important to say again because um, just last week actually, I teach a class in a seminary, and one of the seminary students actually says, he's been a Christian a long time, and he's now dedicating his life to serve God. So he's in seminary, and he actually believed, he comes from a country where the culture is like that, I guess. And I said, you have not left your culture. Your culture says sin, a disease is a result of sin, and you are still believing that disease is a result of sin. And I had to correct him and say, no, not always. A poor person has a reduced offering, okay, still including the male lamb, but less flour, verses 21 and 23, and with the other two lambs replaced by two turtle doves or two pigeons, verse 22, whatever he can afford. The ceremony is reminiscent of the ordination ceremony of ordination in Leviticus 8. There is, blood being sprinkled and dabbed on the ears and finger, thumb and toe, right? And this means that it takes 8 days. So this means that this is really a very important, serious ceremony, serious as the ordination of the priest. Now, the person being cleansed is anointed. Okay, so the priest is anointed, chosen. And so this person is now being anointed too. This ceremony is an indication of God's choosing him. And what does God choose him for? Well, it's a rededication, as I said, for service to the Lord. This is a new person is reborn. And it's just like us, when we are cleansed by Christ, we are regenerated, we are reborn, and we are dedicated to do things for God from henceforth. So this elaborate ceremony is to signify a return of the leprous person to community and to worship and to service in God's kingdom. So like the leprous person, we are sinners, we are condemned outside the camp. Now we are brought back by the blood of Jesus. We are redeemed to serve God, to be his royal priests. 1 Peter 2:9. And so we're just not redeemed for our own sake and our own glory. We're redeemed and saved to do God's will. Now, as for the house cleansing, it only requires the first stage of the human cleansing, verses 49 to 53. And this actually, if you want to draw a lesson, it is this lesson that the earth is tainted with our sin. Not the earth hasn't got a sinful nature. It is not a moral thing, but it is nonetheless affected by our corruption. The sin of Adam and Eve tainted the whole world they lived in. And so the physical environment we live in needs cleansing and care also. And if it's been affected by disease and pollution, whatever it is that we cause, we need to take care of it so that other people will not be affected by that taint, that corruption, that dirt. So we were talking about the haze before we started this study earlier on. The haze is coming into Singapore from Malaysia, and in Thailand there's a huge pollution problem now. Haze is from the burning of the forest as farmers prepare the land for the new planting season. And there is also there are reports of China, northern China, being ravaged by sandstorms coming in from the Gobi Desert, from the north. And the sandstorms are so furious that they actually have been carried over to Japan and Korea. So the world is, as Romans put it, groaning and waiting for redemption by Christ also. And we have a responsibility to this environment because we have created it the way it is. The reason why the desert sand blows from Mongolia all the way to Korea, it's a huge distance, is because there are no trees in between. Human beings have cut off all the trees. And so one of the remedies that China has been trying to do is to plant more trees so that in between the desert and China, there would be a new Great Wall, the Great Wall of trees. So the houses do not commit sin, but they need cleansing, and our environment needs our care and the solutions to redeem it too. So verses 54 to 57 then is a summary of chapters 13 and 14, indicating that both chapters are one unit of instruction. So in closing, what's the application of this passage to us, modern Christians? Well, these chapters in Leviticus illustrate how seriously God treats contamination of His holiness. And anything that is unclean must leave His presence. So He lives in the camp. And so anything that is unclean must leave the camp. And we see that this contamination, this corruption has both a spiritual and a physical element. Physically, sin introduced death and disease into our beautiful world that God made. And the consequences we suffer are consequences that we can remedy too, as I mentioned earlier on. So creation care, we increasingly, I think Christians realize that they have to be in the forefront of taking care of God's creation. But we have long been spiritually aware that sin separates us from God. So now the message has to be, it's not just spiritual, but physical. Creation is fallen and just as much in need of redemption as we ourselves. And that's clear from Romans 8, verses 20 to 23, because Paul says, the creation groans and awaits redemption like us. Christ came to redeem us on Calvary, the first coming, and He has promised to return. And when He returns, He will redeem the earth so that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. In the meantime, we Christians, we are safe to do good works. We are safe to be God's stewards. And we have the responsibility of stewarding the earth and its resources without causing it further damage. And fairly or unfairly, Christians have been accused of teaching domination of the earth and exploitation of the earth because of a misreading of Genesis 1. And we have caused all this pollution and haze and the depletion of resources on earth. Now, sin and corruption in the Old Testament needed a sacrificial system, and that is now fulfilled by Jesus on the cross. Jesus is our atoning sacrifice. All the offerings, burnt, guilt, sin, whatever, all these offerings, Jesus is that offering, the ultimate sacrifice, as Hebrews chapters 9 and 10 tells us. And so we are being reminded again and again in Leviticus that we are redeemed and restored by God to worship Him and to serve Him. We are anointed, chosen for the good works He has prepared in advance for us to do. Ephesians 2:10. So let us go forth and redeem the earth for God. Any questions?